everyone, and welcome to another season of Coast Connections. Have you ever thought of taking it easy and living off the grid, perhaps? Have a whole different change in lifestyle? Well, we're here to tell you it takes a lot of grit to live off the grid, or as our ancestors called it, living. We have an author with us today, Elinor Florence, who's going to walk us through some of the pioneers and homesteaders who broke ground in this country and just the true strength and courage and skills that took. And they had a lot of help from some of the Indigenous people of this country. Elinor Florence, welcome to Coast Connections.
Thank you very much, Liz.
Nice to have you back.
Yes.
Best-selling Canadian author. Your first book was Bird's Eye View, which is still a hot seller about World War II, historical fiction. And now you're taking us to Wildwood, back to our pioneering days of our ancestors.
Right.
Not too far removed, because I myself have some of the memories that are reflected in this story. Mm-hmm. So give us the bird's eye view of this book, Elinor.
Well, it's not historical fiction this time, it's contemporary. It's about a young single mother from Phoenix, Arizona. And I chose Phoenix because I wanted her to come from a really hot place. And one day she gets a phone call from a lawyer telling her that she has inherited an abandoned farm way up in the bush in the Peace River area of northern Alberta, on condition that she lives there for 1 year off the grid with her 4-year-old child. So she takes her little girl and moves up to this farm. It's furnished, but it's been abandoned for many years. And of course, she's completely off the grid, no internet, power, water, or anything. And the book is about whether or not she survives. I won't tell you what happens. You'll have to read the book to find out.
Very good. And what was your inspiration for writing a book about living off the grid?
Well, we just hear so much about it these days, and I know people have kind of a yearning, I think, sometimes to get away from technology and civilization and go back to a simpler lifestyle. And I just wondered, would it be possible for a young woman born and raised in a big city to do that and survive? So I wanted to explore that concept.
And it's a fascinating exploration. You did a whole lot of research on this book to come to the story that you're threading. And I think the beauty of the story is you not only have the modern day homesteader, Molly, but also her great aunt who lived in the house before her. We're getting the reflection of that through the great aunt's diaries, which she finds in the attic. And her great aunt was only a teenager, 18 years old, when she came to homestead up in the cold northern Alberta climes. So do you think any of the young people today would be able to do what her great aunt did?
Well, I like to think that they could. I have a lot of confidence in our young people, and I think that people rise to the occasion if it's demanded. Possibly they might have to if things go badly in the world and people are forced to live off the grid. But I have confidence that they could do as well as the early pioneers.
Mm-hmm. And some of these pioneers were actually from the cultural elite back in England. I think you mentioned sort of the Downton Abbey type of people who were...
Yes, that's right. They weren't all laborers for sure. I mean, it was people who cashed in their chips back in England or another country in Europe and staked their future on being able to prove up 160 acres of land. Mm-hmm. And the people who had it the easiest were the laborers because they were used to hard work back in the old country.
Right.
The peasant class, but the upper classes really had a struggle. Mm-hmm. And one of the things they had a hard time with was people didn't defer to them the way they did back home because there was no class system among the pioneers. It was
the great leveler.
Exactly.
All living off the land.
Right.
Right. Now, Elinor, you live in Qualicum Beach here on the island. You also live in Invermere. You share your time between those residences. What prompted you to put the setting of this in northern Alberta, in the Peace Country?
Well, I just think it's really a fascinating part of the world. The Peace River runs through northern BC and Alberta, so it isn't specifically an Alberta story. It could be northern BC as well. It's Canada's, in fact, it's the world's northernmost farming community up there. It's very far north, and what makes it possible to grow grain there are the 18 hours of daylight in summer. and the very fertile soil in the river valley, the Peace River Plateau. So it's a very interesting part of the world and spectacularly beautiful. I think you have a
shot of
photograph
the Peace River itself, yeah, which is stunning. I think this is taken in the fall, and it's a stunning photo of the Peace River country. And also, there's a picture of the harvest there too. We've got a couple of combines harvesting the wheat that's grown up there. But not in the way that it was grown when the people of Wildwood were clearing the land.
It was a particularly difficult area for the homesteaders because by the time the homesteading rush had been over almost, all the good fertile prairie soil was taken up. So with the latecomers, we're told, well, if you want your 160 acres, then you have to go north. So they went up there into the bush and they had to clear the land. It wasn't like the prairie sod busters where they could just break the soil. They had to clear the land and remove the trees before they even got going. And then of course it was doubly difficult to get their grain to market until the railway went in 1916. They had a heck of a time.
And in Wildwood, she inherits this beautiful, unabandoned, but a beautiful house called a four-square house. And we've got a couple of photos of a four-square house that we'll show as well. And I was astonished to find out that this four-square house was ordered from the Eaton's catalog and arrived with everything that was possibly needed, including down to every nail and storm window and brick, to be assembled on site.
It was sort of like the IKEA concept, right? You picked a house out of a catalog and sent for it, and it arrived on the train, and in this case had to be taken by wagon and oxen to the location, and then carpenters assembled it on the spot. And the materials were beautiful, and if you had a good carpenter, you had a house that would last at least 100 years.
Wow. And one of those homes is still standing. In what town is that?
In the town of Peace River.
In the town of Peace River.
Yes, it was built for the Northwest Mounted Police Superintendent up there. But you see foursquares everywhere. They were very popular right across North America in cities and towns everywhere.
And it was foursquare because?
Well, it was a very easy home to assemble because it had 4 equal walls, 4 equal roof panels, and 4 rooms on each floor, 4 on the main floor and 4 upstairs.
And a family of how many could live in that comfortably?
Well, upstairs there would be 4 bedrooms, so I guess it just depends on how many slept in a bedroom, but probably 8 or 10.
Yeah. And of course the ubiquitous not ensuite, but outhouse.
Yes, that's right.
There's a great shot of one here.
One of the drawbacks of living off the grid would be using the outdoor toilet.
I like the finishes on the outhouse. I like the antler for the handle.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. But in the wintertime, that would have been a tough trek to get to and from the house and the outhouse as well.
Well, I grew up on a farm in Saskatchewan and we didn't have plumbing until I was 14. So in the winter we had a chemical toilet that my father had to actually empty out every morning, which is a gruesome task, but better than everybody having to go outside.
Totally. In your delicious book, Molly, the protagonist, has to learn to cook and bake, and she's, like a lot of modern women, has bought every cake off the shelf or from the bakery. So she actually has to learn to bake using the Five Roses Cookbook.
She finds an old copy of the Five Roses Cookbook in the farmhouse, the original edition 1913. It's been reprinted many times since then. But back in those days, it was the most popular cookbook in Canada. It was distributed by the Five Roses Flour Company in Montreal to about 1 million households in Canada. It was really the Bible of baking.
It was distributed. It didn't have to be purchased?
I don't think that people bought it. I think it was sent out as a lost leader so that people would cook with Five Roses flour.
Fantastic. And you still find some of these in various book collections or bookstores, and it's real treasure, especially when you see the side notes.
I have a copy, and it has wonderful recipes in it, but it's quite a challenge to bake with it because, of course, it was published before the days of electric stoves, so they were wood stoves back then.
We've got a great shot of a wood stove that you provided as well.
Yeah, okay.
That we'll show our viewers. Yeah.
So the only way you could really determine how long to bake for was to stick your hand in the oven, and the book describes, so you stick your hand in the oven and you count, and if you have to snatch your hand out after a count of 5, then it's a hot oven. If you can keep your hand in for a count of 10, then that's a slow oven.
So they'd say bake this in a hot oven
Yes.
for 20 minutes or a slow oven for an hour.
They didn't even give it time. So you were on your own. And of course there was no little glass door, so you couldn't look at it either.
Of course. Yeah.
Yeah.
And on these wood stove, there was also a stove reservoir. And what was that for? It was
Heating water or melting snow. So you had a kind of a tub affair built into the stove with a lid, and you would pour your cold water in there, and then the water would warm up for washing or washing dishes or washing yourself.
nice. One of the other things we talk about in the book, or you talk about in the book, was the help and assistance and friendship that Molly and her daughter and her great aunt received from the Indigenous people, the Cree people that lived nearby. Talk to us about how important those relationships were to the early pioneers and settlers.
Yes, I wanted to shine a light on that because, especially because we hear, so much negative, and rightly so, about the relations between the Indigenous people and the settlers, but it wasn't all adversarial. In many cases, the Indigenous people helped the whites survive, not only by teaching them, but by, physically giving them food if they were starving. And as a result, many lifelong friendships were formed and many marriages, hence the Métis community that exists in Canada today. So there were some positives there for sure.
And teaching them to hunt and
Oh,
trap.
yes.
And
They had essential knowledge of the natural world that the settlers didn't have. And that's why the early fur traders who came over from Scotland and England were encouraged to marry Indigenous women. It was the Indigenous women who kept them alive because they knew what to do.
Right.
Right.
And medicinally as well. And
Oh, yes.
there's some incidents in the book where the local Cree friend virtually saved the life of Molly.
Yeah, and something so simple as boiling spruce needles and drinking the tea to get your vitamin C. Well, the settlers wouldn't have known that, and some of them had scurvy.
You only think of scurvy on the high seas, of those early explorers, not right here on the prairies. But those are life-giving, life-saving tips.
Feeding themselves in winter was a real challenge.
In the book, Elinor, there's a description of a grizzly bear attack, which is very graphic, and it sounds very firsthand. Was that something you yourself experienced, or how did you research that? Because that was very chilling.
I read everything I could find on the subject.
Okay.
I fortunately, although I have had encounters with black bears in our neighborhood in Invermere, I've never encountered a grizzly, and I hope I never will. Yeah. I mean, bears are unpredictable predators, and they're dangerous animals.
And they certainly live in the Peace River country as well. And another thing they'd have to encounter, the wildlife that they're certainly not used to while they're out there foraging and looking for things to eat. Throughout your book, there's some terms that are in there that have just basically left our vocabulary, no longer in our lexicon. So I want to run some of these by you, and we can talk about some of these terms. In terms of clearing the land, there's stumping, grubbing, and stoking.
Well, stumping is, of course, hauling out the big stumps, and grubbing is pulling out the little saplings that are everywhere. Stooking is when you take sheaves of grain and pile them in a triangular fashion so that the rain won't get in and soak them before the threshing crew arrives to harvest them.
So these sheaves of grain had to physically be picked up by hand bound
Yes.
and then arranged in what they call rooster back fashion, with, I guess, the tops of the stooks facing each other so the water would
Right.
fall off of them.
Right.
So stumping is not just a political term.
No.
Very interesting. Corduroy Road, that's something we don't talk about anymore. What's a corduroy road?
Well, it was very muddy and muskeggy up there. So in spring thaw, the roads were impassable. So they would cut trees down and lay them across the road, so the wagons could get across. And so they were bumpy like corduroy. So
Yeah. Wow. And the horses trudging through the mud and Interesting.
very hard on the horses.
Very hard. And those are sort of the unsung heroes of the homesteading days.
Yes.
Those were family members. They were vital to the survival of the pioneers, weren't they?
The mosquitoes were a terrible challenge as well. I read in one book that the mosquitoes were so bad you couldn't tell what color the horses were. No, you can imagine the poor horses. That they used to smear them with bear grease, especially around their faces and noses to keep the bugs away.
Horrible. And then they also did smudging, didn't they?
Yes.
With the smoke to try and keep the
Exactly.
mosquitoes and flies and deer flies away.
Yeah.
And you mentioned also in your book that the mosquitoes could be so thick up there that if a child was lost in the bush, they could actually die of mosquito bites.
They could.
Unfathomable.
Yeah.
Isn't that crazy? Wow. Tough, tough times.
Yes.
You know, to be one of these pioneers or homesteaders, you had to be everything: a carpenter, a veterinarian, a seamstress, a baker, a nurse, a doctor. I mean, so self-sufficient.
Yes.
And those are skills that we've all lost. I mean, we can all search on the web and we can, look up various things with our technology, but living off the grid, I tell you, that's a whole new world. What are flue covers?
Well, people used to have usually kind of a wood furnace in their basement, and the stovepipes would go up into the upper story, and there'd be a hole in the stovepipe, so that's where the warm air would come out and warm up the upstairs. And then in the summer, when you didn't need the furnace wasn't on, you'd hang a painted pie plate or something decorative over the hole to cover the flue of the stove.
Cool. Like we have register covers
Yeah.
in our floors, same thing,
Right.
except theirs were artsy.
Yeah.
Yeah, fun. A sad iron.
I don't know why they call it a sad iron. It would make you sad if you had to use it, but those were the flat irons that they heated on the surface of the wood stove to iron their clothes with.
Yeah.
It had a wood handle, so that didn't conduct the heat, but the metal got hot, and then you'd iron your clothes and put it back on the stove.
And you'd have a series of them so you could
A couple
keep ironing.
anyway,
Yeah.
You'd take the handle and just clamp it onto the other one and use that one while that one got hot.
A treadle.
A treadle sewing machine, sewing off-the-grid sewing machine, and they still work like a charm. I know people who are still using their treadle machines.
The Singer sewing machine.
Right.
Ubiquitous. You can see it all over the world still.
So it's got a crank that gets it going, and then a foot pedal that keeps the needle moving up and down. It's a mechanical contraption.
And you have to have the rhythm of the handle and the treadle going at the same rate, right? To get a
kind of a knack that you have to master. Yes.
And they called the Singer sewing machine the woman's friend around the world or something like that.
I'm sure it still is to this day.
Yeah. Well, you see them in markets in Morocco and India and Africa. They're still using them. Again, doesn't require any power except a bit of elbow grease and ankle power.
That's right.
Yeah. Very interesting. Elinor, what's a stone boat?
Well, it's a little wooden platform with wooden runners that you hitched behind your horse, and you just used it to pick up stones with. So you'd take the horse out in the field and pick up the big rocks and put them on the stone boat and take them somewhere and dump them, just to get rid of all the rocks that are in your field.
Yeah. Wow. And again, bare hands, One of the things,
mind you, that's still being done today. I know my brother on the farm and his son pick rocks all the time in exactly that way.
There you go.
Yeah.
Do they have a stone boat or
They do.
a Ram 5000 pickup?
Well, the stone boat is only a couple of feet off the ground, so you don't have to lift it into the truck, right?
Now, winter times, because your protagonist, Molly, again, came from Phoenix, very, very hot place, to northern Alberta, BC, which can get up to like minus 60. So, again, how do you survive a winter like that?
Well, that's her challenge for sure. She has to keep the wood stove burning day and night. You know, if the fire goes out and you're in bed and you happen to fall asleep and don't wake up, you might never wake up if it gets cold enough. So she had the alarm clock set so that she could get up in the night and keep stoking the fire.
So how did they get up in the middle of the night without alarm clocks?
I think they probably had clocks of some kind, or pocket watches or something, but
or a good sharp elbow.
Yeah, they would have been light sleepers if they if they knew it was a matter of life and death.
Mm-hmm. And again, in the book, I mean, they were saved by using mucklucks that the Indigenous people brought them in the wintertime that kept their feet from getting frostbite and their hands as well. They had.
Yes, they didn't. They, in many cases, brought woolen clothing from England or another country, but they didn't really understand the importance of animal hides, which were what really kept you warm. The buffalo hides in winter, and the mucklucks, and the, gloves.
And there's nothing to prepare you for that. Where do you go to, Buffalo Hide 101?
They were completely unprepared, just had no clue. They'd never even seen a picture of Canada, so they had no idea what to expect. Fortunately, the settlers helped each other as well. There certainly was a huge bond in, helping your neighbor. If you left your cabin or your home, you'd never lock it, and you'd always make sure there was food inside in case somebody needed to, take shelter. And they shared their experiences as much as they could.
Right. How did they get together socially when they were, very isolated? Like, this was a long way from any town.
It would be a big effort.
Yeah.
They would have the occasional, Christmas party or dance or something, and they would meet.
And cabin fever is a very real thing, where people sort of just kind of lose it from having, I think you called it the Siberian dilemma, where there's 9 months of winter and 3 months of tough sledding.
That's right.
You never really get a break.
That's right.
Just enough time to grow that crop for, the 18-hour days.
People actually did lose their minds and have to be taken out or leave.
Yeah, horrible to be so isolated. Yeah. And can you imagine being a pioneer mother in the dead of one of those winters with 4 or 5, 6 children in the house? What do you do to keep these kids occupied during these heavy winters where they literally cannot go outside because it's life-threatening temperatures?
I asked myself that question so many times when I was writing the book. What would you do to amuse the kids? And what would you do to care for, babies? I mean, people were giving birth in these cabins, and somehow most of them managed to survive.
And a lot of them were calling on the local Indigenous women for midwifery purposes when babies were being born, weren't they?
That's right.
Yeah. What was one of your biggest surprises in researching this book?
I wouldn't say it was a surprise exactly, but I was pleased by the fact that when I was reading all these pioneer memoirs, and I especially tried to find ones written by women, they were so happy to be there. We've talked a lot about the hardships and the work and everything, but women in particular were very happy to be living that lifestyle because they were free from the constraints of gender, which from the old country, and they were equal partners with their husbands. They were, they had to be, and they were respected, and they learned all these skills, and they achieved something, and it was very different from being, just a a nurse or a teacher or a mother back in the old country. So that was exciting to read.
That
those
is
things.
exciting. And that's good to know too, that it wasn't all just hardship. There was a lot of purpose, there was a lot of meaningful work
Yes.
and reward.
Yes.
You know, just the fact you're growing your own food, you're, that in itself is very rewarding and very healthy.
Well, getting title to 160 acres, which you would never ever have been able to do back home, was, you know, life-changing and so exciting and gratifying for people.
Yeah, very exciting. And that Homesteaders Act, I think, was it 1912 that this one was initiated for this particular wave of homesteaders?
It actually lasted, the Homesteading Act lasted right up until the 1930s.
Okay.
Because they were still homesteading up there in northern Alberta and BC into the 20s.
Wow.
Yes, I mean, you know, in the rest of the country, we were driving automobiles and, you know, wearing short skirts in the 1920s. They were still leading the life of a generation earlier up there.
Fascinating. Well, Elinor, it's a really good read. I really enjoyed this book. It was as equally enthralling as your first book I read,
Thank you.
The Bird's Eye View. It just has a completely different subject matter. But again, I want to just comment on how well researched this is, because you did a tremendous amount of work in looking at the backstory. And I think readers will really find this an interesting story.
Good.
And I think it would make a really good movie.
Thank
I
you
really
so much.
do. Yeah. Who'd you star as Molly?
Oh, maybe Reese Witherspoon?
Yeah,
I don't
think
know.
Maggie Smith would be the good,
Oh, yeah.
great aunt.
Yes,
Yeah.
perfect.
Yeah, she would be perfect. See her in a pair of
Yeah.
Carhartt
Yes.
coveralls. Yeah. Thank you, Elinor. We wish you all the best with this latest book of yours, and continue writing, because we certainly enjoy continue reading. And viewers can find out more on your website, elinorflorence.com, and also sign up for your blog, which is a really interesting read as well.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth.
Pleasure to have you here again. All the best. And thank you for joining us on Coast Connections, and we will see you next time. Thank you.